The village of Little Brinford, tucked beneath the soft rolling hills of the English countryside, prided itself on being precisely the kind of place where nothing unexpected ever happened. Days unfolded predictably, the postman whistling down Elm Lane at 8 sharp, Mrs. Dalloway's curtains twitching at precisely 9, and the scent of freshly baked scones drifting out of the old manor tea rooms just after noon. Life was orderly, pleasant, and as unremarkable as a lace doily on a vicar's table. Before we begin unraveling this twisted mystery, do make sure you've subscribed. Miss Marple would hate for you to miss the next clue. It was on such a perfectly ordinary afternoon that the extraordinary occurred. The sun hung politely in the sky, neither too bright nor too shy, and the hedgerows were alive with the chirping of sparrows. A gentle breeze stirred the early autumn leaves along the gravel path that wound through Marbury Wood, a place beloved by the villagers for afternoon walks and quiet contemplation. It was here, just after 3 o'clock, that a local woman named Eleanor Walsh set out on her daily constitutional, a habit so regular it could have been set to the town clock. Eleanor, known for her impeccable punctuality and even more impeccable opinions, never missed her walk. She always took the same route, past the old oak, across the wooden footbridge, and then back again before returning home to brew a modest pot of chamomile tea. She was seen heading toward the woods by at least 3 people: Mrs. Brookwell watering her begonias, young Timothy Briggs pedaling his bicycle with reckless enthusiasm, and Mr. Tupper unloading onions outside the grocer's. But Eleanor Walsh did not come back by 4 o'clock. Her neighbor Mrs. Pembleton noticed that Eleanor's curtains remained open, a grave deviation from her ritualistic routine. By 4:30, whispers began to travel across doorsteps and through shop counters. By 5, half the village was craning their necks at their windows, wondering why the quietly predictable afternoon had begun to feel so unsettling. Just before sunset, a search party was assembled, a mixture of villagers armed with lanterns, walking sticks, and far more confidence than expertise. They combed through Marbury Wood in uneven clusters, calling Eleanor's name with growing urgency. The woods responded only with the rustle of leaves. And then, quite without warning, a shout pierced the stillness. It came from the old footbridge, near the stream where children often played in summer. 2 villagers, Mr. Hollis and his teenage daughter, Clara, stood frozen, Clara clutching her father's sleeve as if afraid the world might tilt beneath her feet. On the bank of the stream, partially concealed by an overgrown bramble, lay Eleanor Walsh, or rather what remained of her composure and dignity. Eleanor was sprawled awkwardly on the ground, her walking stick cast aside, her hat lying several feet away, as though it had been thrown rather than dropped. Her expression, fixed, startled, utterly lifeless, told the villagers everything they did not wish to know. She was dead. For a moment, Little Brinford held its breath. Then chaos erupted. Voices echoed through the woods, panicked, confused, insistent. Some insisted she must have slipped. Others whispered that the position of the body looked wrong, too unnatural. And a few, those who had heard Eleanor utter sharp remarks about one villager or another, quietly wondered whether someone had simply had enough of her meddling tongue. By the time the constable arrived, young Constable Harrow, barely experienced enough to manage the lost dog reports that comprised most of his duties. The entire village was huddled around the scene, forming a trembling half-circle of speculation, and slightly behind them all, unnoticed despite her pale blue cardigan and unmistakably sensible hat, stood Miss Jane Marple. Miss Marple had not intended to be part of the commotion. She had been on her way to the vicarage to return a borrowed gardening book when she noticed, from a polite distance, the unusual cluster of villagers scurrying toward the wood. Curiosity, or rather concern masked as curiosity, prompted her to follow. Now she watched, quietly, thoughtfully, as Constable Harrow attempted to restore order. "Please, step back. All of you," he insisted, though his voice shook slightly. "We mustn't disturb anything. Mrs. Walsh may have taken a fall." "A fall?" scoffed Mrs. Brookwell. "She walked that path every day for 15 years. And she's got no reason to be scrambling down near the stream." She crossed her arms firmly, as though personally offended by the suggestion. "You don't suppose," whispered Mr. Tupper to anyone who would listen, "that she was pushed?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple did not gasp. Instead, her eyes drifted to Eleanor's hands. One glove was torn. The other was missing entirely. Her gaze shifted to the disturbed patch of earth near the bramble, to the faint scuff marks leading toward the footbridge, and then to Eleanor's hat lying upside down, its rim embedded with a small clump of soil. "Strange?" Miss Marple murmured softly, though no one heard her. Constable Harrow cleared his throat and attempted a tone of authority. "Everyone, please return home. I'll notify Inspector Farrow in Muchleon Hill. He'll know what to do." But the villagers remained rooted in place, unwilling or afraid to return to their quiet routines now that the ordinary had been so violently disrupted. Miss Marple stepped forward only briefly, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, not at the body, not at the villagers, but at a tiny, nearly invisible thread caught on the rough wooden rail of the footbridge, a pale blue fiber, fluttering gently in the breeze. That no one else noticed it. No one else even looked in that direction. But Miss Marple saw it, and in that moment, she knew, as surely as she knew the vicar would forget his umbrella again tomorrow, that Eleanor Walsh's walk had not ended accidentally. Something or someone had stopped her. Miss Marple said nothing. Not yet. The village, still trembling with fear and speculation, was not ready for her quiet conclusions. But she did know one thing. This was no simple fall, and Little Brinford was about to discover just how many secrets could hide behind a hedge, inside a teapot, or beneath the polite smile of a neighbor. News travels differently in a village than it does in a town. In Little Brinford, it moved like jam pressed between two slices of bread, slow and inevitable, staining everything it touched. By the time the lanterns were put away and supper dishes clinked in quiet kitchens, every parlor and porch had its own version of what had happened by the footbridge. Each retelling added a tale, subtracted another, and never failed to reveal more about the storyteller than about the deceased. At the vicarage, Reverend Ellis paced the length of his sitting room, fretting over the moral implications of gossip as much as the practical ones of an inquest. "We must be charitable," he told his sister, who insisted that charity did not require the forgetting of what one had seen. Mrs. Ellis had seen Mr. Tupper standing too long near Eleanor's gate that morning, and she had seen the way his face flushed when Eleanor had admonished him for some imagined slight. At the old manor tea rooms, Mrs. Dalloway set down her saucer with a little more force than usual, declaring the entire affair most unbecoming. Behind the counter, the assistant, a nervous young woman named Betty, confided to a regular that Eleanor had been arguing with someone by the post office earlier that week. The regular simply nodded, then added, "Well, who hasn't argued with Mrs. Walsh?" As if that excused everything. The children at the schoolyard were the most imaginative. Timothy Briggs, who had seen Eleanor walk into the wood that afternoon, swore he had heard a muffled shout and the snapping of twigs. Little Sybil, enthralled with the drama of grown-up secrets, claimed she had seen a tall figure in a dark coat slipping away across the fields. Her mother, who practiced the art of private superstition, told Sybil to be quiet and not to invent things that would take root. Each account planted seeds. Motive here, opportunity there. The list of people who might have wished Eleanor harm grew faster than anyone could tally. She had a tongue that fenced with the dignity of a retired schoolmistress. She had exposed minor hypocrisies at the Women's Institute. She had once, some whispered, stirred up a scandal years ago regarding a disputed will. To Eleanor's neighbors, these peccadillos were both the proof of her character and the potential reasons for her death. Inspector Farrow from Muchleon Hill arrived the next morning with the hard, efficient gait of a man accustomed to trimming facts into neat shapes. He was a man who trusted official reports and found the human heart a troublesome, peripheral matter. He spoke with the constable, took photographs with a small camera, and directed polite questions at the villagers assembled at the green. His notebook filled with names and times, parceling the afternoon into pieces he could slot into boxes. Miss Marple observed him as a child might observe a new toy, interested, not impressed. She had no use for the pretense of expertise that insisted on neat lines where living things had curved. When questioned, Inspector Farrow made general notes about slips, possible fainting, and the lack of immediate evidence of foul play. He listened politely when residents offered conjectures, and then dismissed most of them with the practiced neutrality of a magistrate. "The coroner will decide," he declared, tapping his pen. "We mustn't inflame the village with speculation." Speculation, however, had been inflamed already. It was the village's way of keeping fear at a manageable distance. If you named a suspect, you had less to fear from the unknown. Miss Marple, meanwhile, performed none of the outwardly decisive acts that made people believe a mystery was being handled. She kept to her usual rounds, visited the library, and stopped at the grocer's to inquire after the quality of new potatoes, as if the world had not shifted. Yet she listened. Villagers came to her whether she invited them or not. Sadness and curiosity have a way of leaning toward someone who will take them seriously. Mrs. Pembleton, Eleanor's next-door neighbor, came first. She came like most people came to Miss Marple, with an apology tucked into the explanation and a piece of scandal on her tongue. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple," she sniffed, eyes misting. She'd been so disagreeable lately. Said things about old friends, about Mr. Hollis's lending habits, about Clara's. Her voice broke and she hurried away, leaving the rest implied. Miss Marple nodded, only briefly. "Eleanor had a habit of speaking plainly," she said. "Some folk find plainness a cheat. Sometimes it clears things up. Sometimes it makes enemies." "And you don't think anyone might have wanted her gone?" Mrs. Pembleton asked, hopeful for absolution or accusation, whichever leaned more comfortably to her sympathies. Miss Marple sipped her tea and smiled the way she smiled when she had no intention of saying too much. "Sometimes people are very good at making themselves disliked, dear. But making oneself disliked and making oneself a target are different matters." Word reached Miss Marple of an old grievance involving a small estate in the neighboring parish, a dispute years ago that had left the family's fortunes altered and reputations bruised. A quiet figure named Harold Lockett, who now kept largely to his small holding, had been bitter then, and bitterness plants roots that can feed other things. Harold was added to the village ledger of suspicion. There was also Clara Hollis, whose trembling presence at the discovery had been remarked on. She had been engaged to marry a promising young man who recently broke the engagement under circumstances. That involved whispered letters and one overheard accusation that Eleanor had once made. Clara's father, stoic and red-faced, stood his ground at the green, but the villagers suspected that where a daughter blushes, secrets lie. And then there was Mr. Tupper, the grocer, whose onions were suddenly less discussed than his conspicuous presence near Eleanor's gate that morning. People are excellent judges of what small things reveal, or they will be after enough time. As the days folded into one another, the inquest was set, and the coroner's man did his work with solemn efficiency. Inspector Farrow, who had at first suggested an accidental fall, began in private to assemble a sturdier theory. He found a bruise on Eleanor's temple that did not fit neatly with a slip but could, with a little stretch of the imagination, still be explained as such. The torn glove and the missing glove were catalogued as oddities. The pale blue thread Miss Marple had seen became, in official reports, simply a fiber of no immediate consequence. Miss Marple read those reports with the sort of care that a gardener reads the weather. Threads and torn gloves could be misleading if one insisted they were everything. But she had noticed other things too. A habit of tucking scraps into pockets. An old-fashioned scarf with a peculiar scent. An odd arrangement of stones by the stream. Small domestic things. The sort that tell you about habit, and habit tells you about opportunity. That evening, as Little Brinford settled but did not quite sleep, gossip continued to circle like moths. The villagers reeled over their tea and wondered at what they thought they knew. Each conjecture was a mirror held up not to the crime, but to themselves. Miss Marple, sitting by her own window with her knitting in her lap, listened to the distant echoes of voices. She had always been fond of watching how people gave themselves. Away not with words, but with the way they arranged a chair, the way they avoided the mention of names, the way they lingered too long in a doorway. She was not yet ready to speak. She watched, and the village, in its slow, careful way, kept revealing itself to her. Little Brinford had provided its first clues. It would provide more, until the pattern became plain. For now, though, the most urgent thing was not to accuse, but to be patient. In a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, the truth would slip out eventually. Often not from the mouth of a criminal, but from the clumsy honesty of a neighbor with a guilty habit of confession. Miss Marple made a small note of the names already circulating: Hollis, Tupper, Lockett, Pembleton. She added another name beneath them, not yet spoken of in public, a name that made her fingers still for a moment as she threaded her knitting needle. She intended to visit the Hollis household. Tomorrow, the morning after the inquest date was announced. Little Brinford wore a curious mixture of solemnity and excitement. A death always unsettled the routines of the village, but a suspicious death. It was a rare, almost theatrical disturbance. People wanted to be respectful, of course, but they also wanted to know everything. They wanted to compare theories, dissect expressions, and place themselves ever so gently near the center of the unfolding drama. Inspector Farrow stationed himself temporarily in the village hall, converting the Women's Institute tea table into a workspace for his notes and statements. The hall smelled faintly of lavender polish and sponge cake, an aroma that did little to lend gravitas to criminal investigation. Farrow, however, appeared determined to make it feel official. He set his hat precisely on the chair beside him, aligned his papers in careful rows, and instructed Constable Harrow to bring in villagers, one at a time, without the slightest fuss. Constable Harrow, who made fuss by the very nature of his nervousness, nodded, hovered, and left to fetch the first interviewee. Miss Marple had no intention of presenting herself at the hall unless invited. She believed in order and propriety, and she equally believed that interference, particularly from elderly ladies, was best applied gently and indirectly. Instead, she began her own quiet stroll through the village, visiting the places where people naturally congregated and where truths, like crumbs, often fell unnoticed. Her first stop was the Hollis household. The cottage stood neat and tended, its garden carefully maintained by Mr. Hollis himself, who prided his roses on blooming earlier than anyone else's. But that morning, the roses hung with their petals slightly bruised, as if they too sensed the household's unease. Clara Hollis opened the door, her eyes still red from the previous day. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm afraid we're not receiving visitors today," Clara murmured, her voice trembling. Miss Marple's smile was soft, almost apologetic. "My dear, I quite understand. I merely wished to return your mother's embroidery frame. I found it tucked behind my sewing basket and feared she might need it. That was all it took." Clara stepped aside with a grateful nod, ushering Miss Marple into the quiet, dimly lit sitting room. Mr. Hollis stood by the mantel, pipe unlit, staring at it as though unsure how to continue even that familiar habit. "Terrible business," he muttered. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed gently. "I understand it must have been difficult to find yourself so immediately involved." Clara winced at the reminder of discovering Eleanor's body. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap. "It was awful," she whispered. "I keep seeing her there. I can't sleep. I don't understand how she fell. I mean, she must have tripped, but you don't believe that," Miss Marple said, her tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. Both father and daughter froze. Clara swallowed. No, not really." Mr. Hollis shifted his stance. "What makes you say that, Miss Marple?" "Because, Mr. Hollis, I have seen many accidents in my day, and people are terribly predictable in speaking of them. But Clara, you keep glancing at the window, not the floor, not the ground, but the window. That tells me you're recalling something outdoors, something you saw or think you saw." Clara's breath hitched. Miss Marple continued quietly. "You needn't unburden yourself if it pains you, my dear. But I assure you, the truth is rarely as frightening as the imagining of it." Clara's eyes glistened. She inhaled, steadied herself, and spoke. I saw someone," she whispered, "just before we found her." Her father stiffened. "Clara, you said that didn't matter," she insisted. "But it does. It must." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Someone? On the path?" Clara nodded rapidly. "A man, I think. It was only a glimpse. A dark coat, moving away from the stream." She squeezed her hands tightly. "I thought perhaps it was just a walker who didn't want to get involved. But no." Her voice faded. Miss Marple asked softly, "Did he seem tall?" "Yes," Clara whispered. "And walking quickly. Too quickly for someone simply out for an afternoon stroll." Mr. Hollis rubbed his temple. "You'll only stir trouble, Clara. The inspector will make a mess of conclusions." Miss Marple gave him a reassuring look. "Mr. Hollis, it is better to know of such a sighting than not to. And Clara, thank you." Before leaving, she added gently, "One more thing, my dear. When you approached the bank, did you happen to see Eleanor's second glove?" Clara frowned. "No, only the torn one on her right hand." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. After offering her condolences and taking her leave, Miss Marple made her way toward the grocer's shop. As she walked, she reflected on the new information. A tall man in a dark coat, not in itself suspicious. Many men own such coats. But running, yes, people do run, but rarely without reason. And certainly not just after encountering a dead or dying woman. Unless, of course, the encounter was no accident. At Tupper's groceries. Miss Marple entered just as Mr. Tupper was rearranging apples with exaggerated care, the kind one has when attempting to look busy. His wife, a brisk woman with sharp eyes, was slicing cheese at the counter. "Morning, Miss Marple," Mr. Tupper said, his voice too hearty. "Bit of a shock, all this business." "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple said. "I imagine it has been quite upsetting for you. I understand you saw Eleanor passing earlier that day." Mr. Tupper faltered slightly. "Well, yes, but plenty of people saw her. Nothing unusual about that." Miss Marple nodded politely. "Quite so. But I also heard you had exchanged words with her last week." "About a delivery?" Mrs. Tupper's knife paused mid-slice. Mr. Tupper cleared his throat loudly. "Nonsense. Eleanor always found something to complain about. Hard woman to please, that one. But no harm done." "Of course," Miss Marple said with a serene smile. "Though I do remember how particular she could be. She once returned an entire basket of plums because one had a blemish." Mr. Tupper blushed. It had been his basket. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Do you recall which direction she walked after leaving your gate yesterday?" Mr. Tupper hesitated. Mrs. Tupper spoke first. He told me she headed toward Marbury Wood, same as always. Yes, Mr. Tupper agreed hastily. Routine, like clockwork. Miss Marple studied him for a quiet moment. You seem troubled, Mr. Tupper. I do hope it is not guilt weighing on you. Both Tuppers stared at her. Then she added, with gentle innocence, guilt about not telling the inspector everything you saw. Mr. Tupper paled. Miss Marple. I didn't, It's nothing that matters. Everything matters, Miss Marple said kindly. He swallowed hard. Fine. She wasn't alone when she passed me. She was speaking to someone. Someone? A man. Tall, wearing a dark coat. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened ever so slightly. Did you recognize him? Mr. Tupper shook his head. No. He kept his face turned away. Mrs. Tupper pressed her lips together, as though holding back something she very much wished to say. Miss Marple thanked them both and departed with a small bag of tea, purchased solely to avoid appearing nosy. Though she had no illusions, the couple didn't see through the pretense. Outside, she paused. Two separate accounts, both describing a tall man in a dark coat, near Eleanor shortly before her death. Coincidence was possible, but in Miss Marple's long experience, it was never wise to begin an inquiry by assuming the simplest explanation was correct simply because it was simple. She continued her walk, purposeful now. Next on her list was Harold Lockett, the reclusive farmer with a bitterness that had soured more than his own temper. The early investigation had begun, though only Miss Marple truly understood how quickly a village's secrets could unravel once someone started pulling at the right thread, and she had already found a thread worth pulling. Inspector Farrow called it a productive morning, though Miss Marple privately thought he had merely shuffled the same facts into new piles. Still, his confidence soothed the more anxious villagers and lent an air of progress, and nothing calms a village like the sense one is marching toward a tidy conclusion. By midday, Farrow had assembled what he called his preliminary shortlist. Clara Hollis, emotional, distressed, and unreliable in her account of events. Mr. Tupper, known quarrel with Eleanor and suspicious evasiveness. Harold Lockett, unresolved resentment from an old legal dispute. Eleanor once meddled in. It was, in Farrow's mind, a perfectly sensible set of suspects. 3 people, 3 motives, 3 opportunities. But Miss Marple, who had seen many sensible lists crumble under the weight of one overlooked truth, remained politely skeptical. After Miss Marple's visit earlier that morning, Clara had withdrawn into her home, leaving her father to fend off curious neighbors. Her emotional state was being whispered about in drawing rooms and across hedges. Poor girl. She's hysterical. She must have imagined seeing someone. Her. Heartbreak has muddled her senses. Villages have an uncanny gift for turning trauma into character flaws. Inspector Farrow was especially concerned with Clara's sighting of a tall, dark-coated man, not because it suggested a suspect, but because it complicated his tidy hypothesis of an accidental fall. People under emotional duress see shadows, he told Constable Harrell. Hallucinations of fear. Miss Marple nearly smiled when she overheard that remark. In her experience, people under emotional strain often became more honest, not less, too shaken to maintain the little lies they normally use to smooth social encounters. If Clara said she saw someone, Miss Marple was inclined to believe she had seen something. But Clara, despite village speculation, lacked motive. She wasn't the type to harm, and she had been nowhere near Eleanor prior to the walk. Heartbreak was painful, but not murderous. Miss Marple placed a gentle mental question mark beside Clara's name. Mr. Tupper's name now sat on many villagers' tongues. The scene at his shop earlier had only confirmed. What Miss Marple had long suspected, he was holding something back. Not necessarily guilt. Few people in villages withheld information out of malice. More often, they withheld it because it made them uncomfortable, or because revealing it might provoke unpleasant gossip, or simply because they believed it not their place to say. Mr. Tupper had been seen near Eleanor's gate. He had argued with her days earlier. He had seen her with the mysterious toll man. Inspector Farrow found this mixture compelling. Miss Marple found it convenient. Convenience in murder was almost always misleading. Mr. Tupper lacked the temperament for violence. His cowardice was too pronounced, his deference too ingrained. He was terrified of confrontation, much less the sort that left someone dead on a riverbank. Still, he was lying by omission, and Miss Marple intended to find out why. If Miss Marple were to point a finger based on temperament alone, Harold Lockett would be the most promising candidate. He lived on a small parcel of land outside the village proper, tending his hens and keeping to himself. Bitterness clung to him like mist, fed by years-old grievances, among them Eleanor Walsh's involvement in a contested will that had, depending whom one asked, either rightfully distributed property to an estranged cousin or robbed Harold of what he believed was his birthright. Inspector Farrow liked Harold for the crime. He had opportunity. He frequently walked the wooded paths. He had motive, resentment, long held and possibly inflamed by recent encounters. And he had the sort of solitary manner that made people uneasy. So Farrow promptly dispatched Constable Harrow to question him. Miss Marple found this decision decidedly unwise. Constable Harrow, kind but timid, was no match for Harold's brusque manner, and the man was unlikely to reveal more under pressure. Thus, Miss Marple paid her own visit shortly after. Harold's cottage smelled of soil and damp wool. He opened the door with visible reluctance. "What do you want?" he asked flatly. Miss Marple offered him a mild smile. "Just a few minutes of your time, Mr. Lockett. I promise I won't impose." He grunted but stepped aside, not out of courtesy. Miss Marple suspected, but to avoid appearing rude to an elderly lady. The sitting room was cramped, cluttered, and filled with old newspapers. A single pair of men's boots sat drying beside the hearth. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to them, large, dark-soled, and flecked with dried mud. Harold caught the direction of her gaze. "I walk the fields," he snapped. "Not a crime." "Of course not," Miss Marple said with unruffled calm. "And such firm boots, too. Useful in soft terrain." He glowered. "Say what you've come to say." She settled gently into a wooden chair. "I wondered, Mr. Lockett, whether you might have seen anyone in the woods yesterday afternoon." "No." "Not even Miss Walsh?" His jaw tightened. "Didn't see her. Didn't go near the stream." Miss Marple nodded slowly, though she noted the slight flicker in his left eyelid. A nervous tell she knew from experience often indicated a lie. But she didn't challenge him. Instead, she asked something seemingly unrelated. "Do you often mend your own clothes, Mr. Lockett?" He blinked, thrown off. "What? No. I take them to Mrs. Dalloway's niece when they need it." "How practical," Miss Marple said. "And do you recall having anything mended recently?" He scowled. "If you want to accuse me of something, just say it." But Miss Marple did not. She only glanced once more at the boots. Something about them bothered her. Not the size, not the mud, but the pattern of wear. Uneven, very uneven. As if the wearer dragged one foot slightly. But Harold walked evenly, heavily, but evenly. Someone else had worn those boots recently. By late afternoon. Farrow announced to the village that he was nearing a hypothesis. He believed Eleanor had struggled with someone, likely someone she knew, and that the fall had been the result of anger. Not accident. Domestic passions, he explained gravely, are among the most common causes of such altercations. Villagers immediately began pairing suspects with imagined motives. Clara's father might have tried to keep her from seeing someone. Mr. Tupper could have snapped after Eleanor embarrassed him. Harold Lockett has always been unstable. Pharaoh was pleased. He liked it when villagers supplied details that made his theories feel sleek. Miss Marple listened quietly. Pharaoh's theory was not wrong in structure. Yes, someone had likely struggled with Eleanor. Yes, it was someone she knew. Yes, the fall was no accident, but his framing was entirely wrong. This crime was not born of passion. It was born of fear. And fear left a very different trail. Before Miss Marple retired for the evening, she made a final note in her small floral notebook. Harald lies, but not directly about Eleanor. Tupper, withholding, but unlikely to act violently. Clara, truthful, but fragile. Then she wrote a fourth name, one that had not yet been uttered in relation to suspicion, the name of someone who had reason to fear Eleanor's sharp tongue. Someone who had something to lose, something Eleanor might have discovered. Someone whose presence in the woods would not have been noticed by the villagers because they had no reason to look for it. Miss Marple tapped the pencil thoughtfully. This person was not yet a suspect, but they would be. Very soon. Rain clouds gathered over Little Brinford. The following morning, the sort of low, gray skies that made the village feel small and enclosed, like a secret tucked into the countryside. The air smelled of wet leaves and unsettled earth. It was perfect weather, Miss Marple thought, for truths to float closer to the surface. Inspector Pharaoh arrived promptly at 9 to resume interviews. His polished boots clicked importantly against the stones as he approached the village hall. The villagers watched from behind curtains and half-open doors, eager, anxious, and fearful in equal measure. Miss Marple, however, did not go to the hall. She had a different destination in mind, Marbury Wood, more specifically. The footbridge where Eleanor's walk had ended. Miss Marple walked slowly, leaning lightly on her walking stick as she approached the familiar bridge. The stream beneath whispered over smooth stones. As though trying to recite events no one had listened to properly the first time, she stopped at the bridge's railing, the exact spot where she'd seen the clue. Pale blue thread. It had been small enough to escape the constable's notice and, predictably, the inspector's. She doubted anyone else had seen it at all. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the smallest things were most often the threads that unraveled entire tapestries. Today, the thread was gone, likely blown away by the wind or washed into the stream. But Miss Marple wasn't disappointed. She had not come to find it again. She had come to understand it. She knelt slowly, her knees protesting, but her resolve firm, and inspected the wooden railing. The grain was rough. A small splintered edge jutted out near where the thread had been caught. Snagged, she murmured. Someone brushed against it, or was pulled. She rose again and looked toward the bank where Eleanor had lain the day before. The ground was still disturbed, despite the constable's half-hearted efforts to cordon it off. The bramble bush rustled lightly, as though holding its own secrets. Miss Marple leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. There, half hidden in the brush, a tiny scrap of something pale. Not a glove, not a hat. A paper scrap. She reached in delicately with a gloved hand and drew it out. It was a torn corner of a letter. The edge was jagged, hastily ripped. The ink, smudged from moisture, showed only a few legible words. Not say anything. Cannot allow. Tuesday. Miss Marple's brows rose. A letter, torn deliberately, and left near the place where Eleanor died. Eleanor Walsh had not simply come for a walk. She had come to confront someone, or someone had confronted her. Miss Marple placed the paper inside a small envelope in her coat pocket. She looked back toward the path. Tuesday, she repeated softly. Dear me. That was the very day she argued with Mr. Tupper, and also the day Clara received her letter from her former fiancé, and the day Harold visited the solicitor inn, Muchley-on-Hill. But the handwriting on the torn paper, if her old sewing eyes were still trustworthy, did not match any of the villagers she knew, which meant the letter writer was someone not yet part of Pharaoh's list at all. Miss Marple moved slowly down toward the bank, using her walking stick for balance. The mud still bore impressions, though trampled now by boots and careless steps. Most were useless. But near the place where Eleanor's hat had been found, Miss Marple saw something unusual. A footprint, nearly washed away, but not entirely. Large, deep, distinct dot, and beside it, a much lighter print. Smaller. Feminine. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Not just one person at the scene. Two. One much larger. One smaller dot. She examined the larger print more closely. The heel dug sharply into the mud, as if the person had pivoted abruptly. The toe pointed away from the water, toward the path, the angle of someone turning suddenly to flee. The smaller print, though blurred, was positioned oddly, not parallel to the first, but slightly behind it, almost as if the smaller person had been pulled or pushed backward. Miss Marple breathed out slowly. This was no chance encounter, she murmured. Someone was here with Eleanor, and someone else may have arrived unexpectedly. She lifted her eyes toward the footbridge again. The torn paper, the snagged thread, the mismatched footprints. They were not random. They were parts of a pattern. Miss Marple straightened up. The soreness in her back, increasing with every minute spent stooping, was a nuisance she chose to ignore. Someone had met Eleanor in the woods. Someone tall, someone strong, and someone she likely feared. The letter suggested a demand for silence, perhaps about a secret. But the second, smaller footprint told another story. Someone else had been there too. And Miss Marple was nearly certain the second person was a woman. But which? Clara? No. Her shoes were delicate, the footprint broader than Clara S. Mrs. Tupper? Unlikely. Mrs. Pembleton? No. She walked with a slight outward turn. Mrs. Dalloway? Too busy, too far, and her shoes always had a distinctive, narrow heel. And the village women rarely walked in the woods alone. Which left? Miss Marple pressed her lips together. There was one woman who often passed unnoticed. Someone polite, quiet, unassuming. A woman the village never truly looked at, and thus never truly saw. Someone whose presence could be invisible, even if she were standing directly beside them. Miss Marple whispered the woman's name under her breath, and with that, a faint chill, quite unrelated to the damp weather, slipped down her spine. She had found the hidden clue. And now she feared she understood its implication. Someone else had been at the murder. Seen. Not by accident, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. To hide a truth, or to help conceal it. Miss Marple turned away from the stream, her mouth tightening. She needed to speak with Inspector Pharaoh, but more importantly, she needed to speak with the woman whose name she had just whispered. Because that woman had been keeping a secret, a very dangerous one. And Miss Marple intended to uncover it before anyone else in Little Brinford got hurt. Little Brinford was not accustomed to tension. Disagreements, yes. Whispered disputes over hedges, borrowed tools, and misplaced pies, certainly. But tension of the sort that settled over the village now, that heavy atmospheric pressure of suspicion and unease, that was unusual. People felt watched in their own zones, judged in their own routines. Doors that once remained casually open now clicked shut. Curtains that fluttered freely now hung stiffly in place. And secrets, long dormant, long buried, began to stir. Miss Marple, having tucked the torn letter scrap safely into her knitting bag, walked briskly toward the vicarage. Not for guidance nor for comfort, but to observe. The Reverend Ellis was standing in the garden, pruning roses with the careful solemnity of a man who had been thinking about too much for too long. His sister, Mrs. Ellis, was sorting linens near the open door, humming a hymn distinctly off-key, a sign of agitation. "Good morning," Miss Marple called as she approached. Mrs. Ellis nearly dropped the linen. "Miss Marple, oh goodness, you startled me." "My apologies," Miss Marple said gently. "I wondered if I might borrow the church keys. I thought to place flowers for Eleanor. It seemed only proper." Mrs. Ellis hesitated. Too long for such a simple request. "Oh yes, of course," Reverend Ellis said quickly, as if rescuing his sister. He handed over the keys and gave a small, tight smile. "We are still quite shaken. Eleanor was difficult at times, but she was part of our flock." Miss Marple nodded, offering her thanks, but her mind was noting something. Mrs. Ellis had flinched when she approached. Not the flinch of being startled, the flinch of someone afraid of being asked something she didn't wish to answer, which confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. Mrs. Ellis was the woman whose name she had whispered at the stream. Quiet, overlooked, always in the background, always near everyone's business, but rarely involved enough to draw criticism or notice. And Mrs. Ellis had a habit of afternoon walks, usually to the post office or the green, but sometimes, unpredictably, toward Marbury Wood. But Miss Marple didn't confront her. Not yet. Next, Miss Marple passed by the grocer's shop and paused. Raised voices. Mr. Tupper and his wife. It was rare. The Tuppers squabbled occasionally, yes, but never loudly enough to spill into the street. "You said you wouldn't mention it." Mrs. Tupper snapped. "I didn't." Mr. Tupper hissed back. "But she knew. She knew I didn't tell everything. You behave like a guilty man. That's the trouble," she muttered. "You act like you're hiding a murder when all you did was—" She stopped. Miss Marple stepped into the doorway. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. Mrs. Tupper froze. Mr. Tupper blanched, as if they'd both just been caught with stolen biscuits. "How may we help you?" Mrs. Tupper asked stiffly. Miss Marple leaned on her walking stick. "Oh, nothing in particular. I merely wondered if either of you recognized the handwriting on this." She held up the envelope, not the torn letter itself. No, she would save that. But the flap of the envelope, she had torn it from earlier. A harmless sliver. But the Tuppers didn't know that. Mrs. Tupper's eyes widened. Mr. Tupper inhaled sharply, which told Miss Marple everything she needed. They recognized it. Mrs. Tupper caught herself quickly. We can't say, Miss Marple. So many letters look alike." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple said kindly. "But this one, I think, looks rather familiar." She let the silence sit just long enough. Then she added softly, "Perhaps we might speak later, Mrs. Tupper, when your husband is not quite so busy stocking shelves." She left without waiting for a reply. Behind her, Mr. and Mrs. Tupper resumed whispering. Quieter now, more frantic. The Tuppers knew something about the letter, but they were not the only ones. Miss Marple next made her way to the Hollis home. Clara answered the door with the timidity of a frightened sparrow. I can't talk long," Clara said. "Father is resting." "That's quite all right, my dear. I only wanted to ask about something very small." Clara nodded nervously and stepped aside. Miss Marple lowered her voice. "Clara, you mentioned seeing a man in a dark coat that afternoon. Do you recall anything else about him? His shoes, perhaps? His gait?" Clara swallowed. "His walk, it was odd. Not quite limping, but uneven, as if one leg pulled slightly." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. She hit it with a small nod. The boots at Harold Lockett's cottage. Uneven wear, but Harold didn't walk unevenly. Someone else had worn them. Someone borrowing boots, perhaps to pass unseen in the woods. Miss Marple leaned closer. Clara, I must ask, have you mentioned this to the inspector? Clara shook her head. No. He said I was overwrought. That my memory was unreliable. Miss Marple tutted softly. Men do like to believe they are the sole authority on facts, dear. But human observation, especially from someone sincere, is often far more accurate. Clara's eyes filled with relief. Someone finally believed her. One step closer, Miss Marple thought. The truth was loosening its threads. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage to hand back the keys and found Reverend Ellis pacing near the church porch, wringing his hands. Miss Marple, he said with a forced smile, did you find everything in order for your flowers? Oh, yes, she replied calmly. A peaceful place. Except, of course, for the matter of Eleanor's death. The vicar's face tightened. Terrible business, he murmured. I keep thinking if she had only spoken to someone, perhaps. Spoken to whom, Reverend? Miss Marple asked gently. He hesitated. Miss Marple tilted her head. Unless, of course, she did speak to someone, and that someone chose not to repeat what was said. Reverend Ellis's throat bobbed. He did know something, but he wasn't ready to share it. Not yet. As dusk began to fall, Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage's side path, where she knew Mrs. Ellis often lingered at this hour, hanging laundry or trimming the herb pots. And there she was, quiet, intent, trying very hard to appear ordinary. Miss Marple approached pleasantly. Mrs. Ellis, my dear, she said, I wonder if you might assist me with something about Tuesday last. Double quotes. Mrs. Ellis froze, not startled, cornered. What about Tuesday? She stammered. Double quotes. Oh, only your walk, Miss Marple said with perfect mildness. You were seen heading toward Marbury Wood around 3:30. Mrs. Ellis's face drained of color. I always walk that way, she said quickly. Habit. Fresh air. Of course, Miss Marple said. But I wonder, did you happen to see Eleanor during your walk? A beat. A flicker in the eyes. Yes, Mrs. Ellis whispered. She was speaking with someone. A man. Miss Marple nodded. And did she see you? Mrs. Ellis hesitated. No, she murmured. I don't think so. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. But you saw her. Mrs. Ellis nodded again, too slowly. And you saw the man? Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Ellis swallowed. Yes. Did you recognize him? A long pause, a tremble in the hands. Then, yes, Mrs. Ellis whispered. I did. Miss Marple held her gaze. Who was he? The answer, when it came, was barely audible, but it cracked the investigation open. For a long moment, Mrs. Ellis didn't speak. Her breath hovered in the cool evening air, shallow and quick, as if the truth she carried had grown too heavy for her small frame. Miss Marple waited with her characteristic patience, the kind that made people confess without realizing they had chosen to. Finally, in a trembling whisper, Mrs. Ellis said the name. It was Reverend Ellis. Miss Marple did not flinch. She merely absorbed the information with a soft closing of her eyes, as though filing the detail into a familiar drawer in her mind. Your brother, she said gently. Mrs. Ellis nodded, clutching the basket of linens as though it might anchor her to steadier ground. He asked me not to say anything, she whispered. He said it would only complicate things. He didn't want people assuming the worst. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. The village does enjoy assuming. But he didn't, Mrs. Ellis began, then stopped, tears forming in her eyes. He didn't hurt her, Miss Marple. I know my brother. I know his heart. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. I rather believe you do. But she also believed this. People capable of goodness are also capable of great foolishness. And sometimes the fear of a secret, even a small one, could lead to bigger, more dangerous lies. Mrs. Ellis wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. He told me he met Eleanor on the bridge. She asked to speak with him privately. Something about something she had discovered. He didn't say what, only that she was upset, and he was upset too. Mrs. Ellis's voice shuddered. Then he left. He said she wanted time alone. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Did he mention seeing anyone else? Mrs. Ellis shook her head. He insisted she was alone when he walked away. A lie, not a malicious one, a protective one. A foolish one. Miss Marple thanked her gently and continued on her walk, though her mind was racing beneath her calm exterior. Reverend Ellis and Eleanor Walsh had met on the bridge. That was new. Important. But it didn't align with the torn letter. The footprint pattern. The tall man Clara had seen. Nor did it align with the second, smaller footprint. No. Reverend Ellis was present, but not at the crucial moment. He was part of the prelude, not the act, which meant someone else arrived later. Someone taller. Someone who walked unevenly. Someone wearing boots that did not belong to him. Just as Miss Marple approached the village hall, Inspector Farrow emerged with a certain self-satisfied briskness. "Ah, Miss Marple, I was just about to send for you," he said, tapping the edge of his notebook. "I believe we're narrowing in on a suspect." Miss Marple offered a gracious smile. "How fortunate." Farrow held up a piece of evidence sealed in a small envelope. "A letter," he said triumphantly, "found in Eleanor's home. Torn, hidden in a drawer. I believe it's connected." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but her expression did not. "Oh?" she murmured. "How intriguing." "I've arranged the pieces," Farrow said, taking a step closer. The argument with Mr. Tupper, Harold Locket's resentment, Clara's hysterical sighting, and now this letter, a demand for money. Blackmail, possibly. Blackmail, a tempting theory, one that would appeal to an inspector hoping for a tidy narrative. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "And which suspect does this point to, do you think?" Farrow smiled thinly. "Harold Locket." "Ah, the obvious choice. The wrong choice." But Miss Marple didn't contradict him. "Not yet." Farrow lowered his voice. "The man has a temper, and he visited Eleanor last week. She refused to help him with something. We'll find out what soon enough." Miss Marple offered a gentle nod. "Yes, dear Inspector. I'm sure you will." She could tell he'd made up his mind. But the truth rarely fit neatly into the first box someone reached for. That evening, as the village settled into a nervous quiet, a new sound shattered the fragile calm. A scream. High, sharp, and unmistakable. It came from the direction of Harold Locket's cottage. Miss Marple, who had been preparing her evening tea, froze with her hand on the kettle handle. Without hesitation, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. Others were running or stumbling toward the cottage. Lanterns flickered in shaking hands. The villagers gathered in a clumsy cluster. Just as the door burst open. Constable Harrow staggered out, panting. It's Harold," he said breathlessly. He's been attacked." Gasps burst around the crowd. Miss Marple pushed gently forward. "Is he alive?" she asked. "Yes," Harrow said. "Barely. Someone struck him. Hard." Inspector Farrow arrived moments later, pushing past the crowd with all the authority he wished he truly possessed. "Who found him?" He barked. "Mrs. Dalloway," Harrow replied. "She came by to deliver sewing." Farrow cursed under his breath. "Get everyone back. This is a crime scene." Miss Marple stepped closer to the cottage. "Where was he found?" she asked quietly. "In his sitting room," Harrow said. "By the fireplace." Miss Marple nodded, and then without waiting for permission, slipped inside. The room was dimly lit by a lantern Pharaoh had set down. Harold lay slumped beside his overturned chair, breathing shallowly. On the floor beside him lay a boot. One boot dot, large dot, muddy dot, and unmistakably matching the pair Miss Marple had seen earlier, the uneven worn boots. But this one had blood on the heel dot. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. This was not Harold's boot. Harold was the victim, not the attacker. Someone had come to silence him, to stop him from saying something he had known all along. A message delivered violently, and suddenly. Everything shifted. Eleanor Walsh was not the only target. Someone was tying off loose ends. Someone desperate. And if Harold had been next, Miss Marple knew someone else in Little Brinford was in immediate danger. She tightened her shawl, stepped back out into the cold evening air, and looked over the gathered villagers, pale faces, illuminated by lantern light. One of them was lying. One of them was scared. One of them was ready to kill again. And Miss Marple, ever observant, knew exactly who she needed to speak to next. Before another scream broke the night. The attack on Harold Lockett shook Little Brinford more deeply than Eleanor's death. A village could rationalize a single tragedy, an accident, a misunderstanding, a moment of madness. But two violent incidents in as many days? That was something else entirely. That was the work of someone desperate, or someone dangerous. Inspector Pharaoh doubled his patrols. Constable Harrow stumbled through long nights with the trembling energy of a man trying very hard not to admit he was terrified. Doors were bolted, lamps were left burning until dawn, and the village hall buzzed with theories that grew wilder as shadows lengthened. But Miss Marple, seated comfortably in her drawing room, with her knitting clicking softly, was perfectly calm. She finally saw the pattern, the torn letter, the snagged thread, the mismatched footprints, the uneven boots, the second crime, the lies small but telling from several villagers, the fear in Mrs. Ellis's eyes, the evasiveness of the Tuppers, the omission from Reverend Ellis, the half-stories from Harold. All of them were fragments of a truth the inspector had missed entirely. And only one person's, behavior quiet, twitching, guilty bound every clue together like twine around a parcel. A person who had been at the scene both times. A person who walked unevenly. A person who was afraid Eleanor would talk. A person who borrowed boots. A person who saw the letter. A person whose presence was always overlooked. A person who had a secret worth killing for. Now, Miss Marple only needed one thing, a reaction, and she would have it tonight, at 7 o'clock. As the village lights flicked on and a thin drizzle began to fall, Miss Marple sent a polite, handwritten note to the vicarage. My dear, I wonder if you might call on me this evening. I have discovered something quite troubling regarding Eleanor Walsh. I should like to speak to you privately, before anyone else hears of it. J. Marple to Reverend Ellis. To Mrs. Ellis, the woman whose slight limp, if one watched carefully, appeared only when she was tired or frightened. The woman who had been on the woodland path that day. The woman who saw Eleanor with someone. The woman who lied to protect her brother, and perhaps more. The woman who knew of the letter. The woman who recognized the handwriting. The woman who had everything to lose if her secret became known. Miss Marple prepared her sitting room with tea, shortbread, and her kindest smile. At precisely 7:30. There was a timid knock. Mrs. Ellis entered, shawl clutched tightly, eyes darting around as though expecting an ambush. Miss Marple, you wish to speak with me? Oh, yes, my dear, Miss Marple said, motioning to a chair. Do sit. You look chilled. Such miserable weather for October. Mrs. Ellis sat, stiff as a board. Miss Marple poured tea. You mustn't be frightened, she said gently. Fear clouds the truth, and I believe you very much want the truth to come out. Mrs. Ellis swallowed. I don't know what you mean. Oh, I think you do. Miss Marple reached for her knitting bag and withdrew a small envelope, the one containing the torn scrap of letter. Mrs. Ellis flinched violently. Miss Marple placed the envelope on the table between them, her expression serene. This was found near the stream, you know, she said softly. Such an unfortunate place for a letter to tear, unless one were trying to destroy it in a hurry. Mrs. Ellis's breath quickened. Miss Marple, I didn't... You recognized the handwriting, Miss Marple interrupted gently. I saw it in your eyes this morning. You knew exactly who wrote this. Mrs. Ellis's hands trembled. Her cup rattled in its saucer. Please, she whispered. Please don't tell the inspector. Miss Marple sat back, knitting needles clicking once more. I've told no one anything, she said quietly, because I do not believe you did it. Mrs. Ellis looked up sharply, a mixture of hope and terror in her eyes. But you know who did. Miss Marple continued. Mrs. Ellis burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. I was trying to protect him, she sobbed. I thought if I hid it, it would go away, that no one would know. Miss Marple's voice softened. Secrets rarely stay hidden, my dear, especially when people are frightened. Mrs. Ellis shook her head frantically. I never meant for anyone to be hurt. And yet, Miss Marple said gently, 2 people have been. Mrs. Ellis's sobs grew louder until she forced them down with a trembling gulp. It wasn't Harold, she whispered. It wasn't Mr. Tupper. It wasn't anyone the inspector is fussing over. I know, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Ellis slowly raised her head. You do? Oh, yes, Miss Marple said kindly. I knew the moment I saw the boots. Mrs. Ellis went still. So I must ask you, Miss Marple continued quietly, leaning forward just a fraction. Are you ready to tell me the truth? Or must I speak to him myself? The room froze. Mrs. Ellis's tears stopped. She stared at Miss Marple, white as a sheet. You? You know it was him, she whispered. Miss Marple nodded once. And now, my dear, for his sake, and for the village's, it is time you stopped protecting your nephew. Mrs. Ellis gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth, and in that instant, that crack of panic and recognition, Miss Marple had her final proof. The murderer was not the vicar, not Harold, not the Tuppers, not even one of the familiar villagers. It was someone who moved in. Shadows. Someone young, someone desperate, someone Mrs. Ellis had been hiding all along. Her nephew, the man in the dark coat, the man with the uneven walk, the man Eleanor had confronted. And the man who attacked Harold to silence him. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly in her lap. The truth, my dear, she said softly, is already out. Now let us bring it into the light. Mrs. Ellis broke completely, sobbing uncontrollably. The trap had been set. The reaction had been revealed. The final test had been passed. Now only the final revelation remained. Mrs. Ellis's sobs slowly subsided into trembling breaths, each one sounding like a confession waiting to be spoken. The lamplight softened the edges of the room, but nothing could soften the truth that now sat heavy, inevitable, between them. Miss Marple poured the woman another cup of tea, her movements calm and compassionate. Drink, my dear, she murmured. Crying is exhausting work. Mrs. Ellis obeyed, her hands shaking as she lifted the teacup. The silence stretched, patient, expectant, until finally she whispered, He didn't mean to kill her. Miss Marple nodded, her face a portrait of quiet understanding. Few murderers ever intend to, at first. Mrs. Ellis pressed her trembling hands to her face. He wasn't supposed to be in the village at all. He came to me secretly. He said he needed money, that he'd fallen in with the wrong people. Gambling, he said. Debts. Terrible threats. Her voice wavered. "I couldn't turn him away, Miss Marple. He's my sister's boy. She died so young. I promised I'd always watch over him." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand over hers. "You're not the first aunt to make such a promise, nor to bear the weight of it." Mrs. Ellis choked on her next words. "Eleanor found out. She saw him leaving my house late one evening. She overheard us arguing. She confronted him the next day by the footbridge." Miss Marple nodded. This aligned with her deductions. "He demanded she keep silent," Mrs. Ellis continued. "But Eleanor was never one to let wrongdoing pass. She threatened to inform the inspector about him, to expose his dealings. She said it was her moral duty." Miss Marple sighed softly. Eleanor Walsh was a woman of very firm principles. Admirable, but often dangerous. Mrs. Ellis nodded miserably. "He panicked," she whispered. "He grabbed her arm, tried to stop her from leaving. He didn't mean to push her so hard. It was a moment, a single moment. She fell, struck her head. Tears streamed down her cheeks again. When he came running to me, he was frantic, truly frantic. He said it was an accident, but he knew no one would believe him. He begged me to help." "And you did," Miss Marple said gently. "You tore the letter she had written, the only piece of evidence that proved she intended to report him." Mrs. Ellis nodded with a shudder. "But Harold must have seen something, or heard something. He came the next morning, asking questions, asking if I knew anything about Eleanor's last days." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Harold was trying to protect his own secret. Yes, but he was also a man with an unfortunately suspicious nature. He likely guessed something he shouldn't have." Mrs. Ellis clenched her hands. "My nephew overheard him, and he panicked again. He followed Harold home, tried to frighten him into silence. But Harold resisted. There was a struggle, and she broke down again. And now, I don't know what to do." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but steady. "My dear, you must let Inspector Farrow handle it from here." Mrs. Ellis gasped. "No, please. He'll be hanged, Miss Marple." Miss Marple shook her head softly. "I very much doubt that. The law recognizes degrees of guilt. Eleanor's death was a tragic consequence of panic, not malice. And Harold survived the attack. What your nephew needs now is not escape. It is truth, counsel, and proper defense." Mrs. Ellis wept silently. A soft knock broke the room's stillness. Miss Marple glanced at the door. "That will be the inspector, I expect. I sent a note while you were collecting yourself." The woman's eyes widened. You told him?" "No," Miss Marple said gently. "But I asked him to come. It is time for all the threads to be brought together." Inspector Farrow entered, stern-faced, Constable Harrow behind him. They paused at the sight of Mrs. Ellis, pale and shaking. Farrow frowned. "Miss Marple, I must insist." Miss Marple lifted a hand, silencing him. "Inspector, I believe I can now provide you with the name of the person who killed Eleanor Walsh." Every breath in the room stilled. Constable Harrow leaned forward. Mrs. Ellis clutched the arms of her chair. Inspector Farrow folded his arms. "Well, out with it, then." Miss Marple rose slowly, with dignity. She turned to Mrs. Ellis, giving the woman a final, kind nod, the signal she had promised. Then she faced the inspector. "The murderer," she said softly, "is Robert Ellis, Mrs. Ellis's nephew." Gasps rippled through the room. Constable Harrow's mouth fell open. Inspector Farrow's eyebrows shot up. "Robert Ellis? But he hasn't been seen in years." "He has been here," Miss Marple replied calmly, "for several days. In secret, Mrs. Ellis hid him in her home. He borrowed Harold's boots to avoid recognition on the wooded path. He struggled with Eleanor when she threatened to reveal what she knew. and he attacked Harold to prevent him from speaking. Pharaoh's face had turned stony, processing the flood of information. "And your evidence?" he demanded. Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and placed the torn scrap of letter on the table. "Eleanor wrote this," she said. "It references a meeting with someone she intended to report. Mrs. Ellis tore it after her nephew confessed. And the handwriting, Inspector, as the Tuppers can confirm, matches Robert Ellis's. He once worked at the post office, and his script is distinctive." She continued, her voice steady. "The tall man Clara saw, the borrowed boots with uneven wear, the hurried tearing of the letter, the fear in Mrs. Ellis's eyes, Harold's incomplete story, Eleanor's moral stubbornness, and your own overlooked footprint near the stream." Pharaoh blinked. "My what?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Your boot size is a 10.5. The footprint near the water was an 11. And you, Inspector, walk quite evenly." She paused for effect. "Robert Ellis does not." A long silence hung in the air before Pharaoh finally exhaled and nodded stiffly. "Constable, fetch Robert Ellis. He must be found at once." Mrs. Ellis collapsed into sobs again, her guilt finally spilling free. "Miss Marple," Pharaoh said quietly, "you've done it again." Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting. "Oh, I've done very little," she said modestly. "People reveal much, Inspector, if only one listens kindly enough." Dawn broke softly the next morning, the pale light washing over Little Brinford with the fragile calm that follows a storm. Word had already swept through the village, not loudly, but in hushed, amazed murmurs, that the murderer had been found. Not Harold Lockett, not Mr. Tupper, not any of the familiar names whispered in drawing rooms all week, but Robert Ellis, the quiet nephew no one had seen in years. A name that hadn't even appeared on most villagers' mental lists of suspects. That was the thing about Little Brinford. People looked too closely at those they knew well, and not closely enough at those they believed to be irrelevant. By mid-morning, Robert had been located by Constable Harrow and Inspector Pharaoh. He made no attempt to flee. He was found near the old mill path, exhausted, soaked from the night's rain, his face gray with dread. He confessed immediately. It was not a triumphant confession, nor even a dramatic one, just a tired, broken muttering of facts Miss Marple already knew, interwoven with remorse and panic. He spoke of debts, desperation, and the fear that had driven him into foolishness, the struggle with Eleanor, the blow to Harold, the terror every time he saw a lantern shine across the village green. It had all become too heavy. Inspector Pharaoh took him into custody with more gentleness than anyone expected. Perhaps even he recognized the frail boundary between accident, panic, and tragic consequence. Little Brinford, however, reacted with its usual mixture of compassion and judgment that Mrs. Pembleton remarked loudly that she had always distrusted distant relations from elsewhere. Mr. Tupper, who had feared all week he would be wrongly accused, returned to stacking onions with renewed vigor. Mrs. Dalloway expressed that she only ever wished Eleanor had learned to be more polite, though she added this with a sigh, not malice. Clara Hollis, fragile but relieved, thanked Miss Marple tearfully for believing her when others doubted her memory. Harold Lockett, still bruised and bandaged, insisted he needed no sympathy, though everyone noted how softly he spoke afterward, as if the violence had shaken something hollow inside him. The village was healing. Slowly, gently. As villages do. Mrs. Ellis did not leave the vicarage that day. Many villagers assumed she was hiding in shame, but Miss Marple knew better. She visited her just before noon. Mrs. Ellis opened the door with eyes red, but no longer frantic. Her voice was steadier. "I told him to surrender," she said softly, before Miss Marple could speak. He listened. "I hardly expected he would." Miss Marple gave her a warm maternal smile. Fear makes people behave foolishly, my dear. But acceptance, now they can make people behave bravely. Mrs. Ellis swallowed hard. I thought I could protect him, that if I hid the truth long enough, it would sort itself out. It never does, Miss Marple said gently. Secrets have a way of growing heavy, heavier than the truth. The woman nodded, tears forming again. Will he be hanged? No, Miss Marple reassured. Not for this. The law is stern, but it is not cruel. Eleanor's death was unintended, a struggle, not malice. And Harold survived. Mrs. Ellis nodded slowly, relieved, but mourning still. Thank you, she whispered. For being kind, Miss Marple touched her hand. Kindness, Mrs. Ellis, is quite underrated in investigations. Inspector Farrow stopped by Miss Marple's cottage in the late afternoon, hat in hand, expression begrudging. Miss Marple, he said stiffly, I suppose I owe you a word of thanks. Oh, Inspector, there's no need, she said modestly. There is, he insisted. You saw what we all missed. Again. Miss Marple smiled faintly. You were looking for criminality. I was looking for human nature. People are rarely what they pretend to be, Inspector, especially when frightened. Farrow paused, then cleared his throat awkwardly. Still, it was fine work. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, like a gentle applause. You'll find, Inspector, that when one observes people carefully over many years, the patterns become quite familiar. He chuckled. You certainly have the advantage there, Miss Marple. She raised an eyebrow, amused. Farrow turned serious. We'll need your written statement, of course. Of course, she said. I'll bring it by after supper. He tipped his hat. Good day, Miss Marple. And to you, Inspector. By evening, the village returned cautiously to its routines. The vicar conducted a small, quiet service for Eleanor Walsh, a thoughtful blend of affection and acknowledgement of her complicated nature. Children once again dared to laugh in the lanes. Mrs. Dalloway reopened the tea rooms, serving sponge cake at half price for morale. The Tuppers argued less loudly. Harold tended his hens again, though with more peace than bitterness. Clara Hollis lit a candle in her window, a symbol of gratitude and closure. And the footbridge at Marbury Wood, though still haunted by whispers, seemed less ominous in the fading light. But one person reflected more deeply than most. Later that night, Miss Marple sat by her window, overlooking the quiet lane, her knitting resting in her lap. The moon cast a silver glow over the hedges, and the gentle hum of a peaceful village rose from below. She considered Eleanor, so principled, so outspoken, so certain of her moral compass. A woman who had believed righteousness would protect her. But righteousness, Miss Marple knew, was often a poor shield against desperation. She considered Robert Ellis, a young man whose foolishness led to tragedy, yet whose regret showed a heart not wholly lost. She considered Mrs. Ellis, loyal, frightened, and ultimately brave. And she considered Little Brinford, a place like so many others, filled with ordinary people carrying ordinary secrets. Until one secret grew too heavy. Miss Marple sipped her tea and allowed herself a small sigh. Human nature, she murmured to the quiet room. Always predictable, and yet always surprising. The village slept. The danger had passed. And Miss Marple, ever composed, ever observant, picked up her knitting once more, ready should the need ever arise to unravel the next tangled thread life might present.